What's up guys, my name is Ace, and a couple days ago we got the big weapon update that I covered in great detail yesterday, where they adjusted headshot damage, they reduced idle sway pretty much across the board, and one of the big things is they very significantly reduced the amount of visual recoil or gun shake that you see when firing your guns. And this wasn't a change to the recoil patterns themselves, the guns actually have the same recoil, it's just the visual aspect of this that was changed, so the guns aren't rotating and jumping around and potentially obstructing your target nearly as much as they were before that update. And I really thought this would be a universally loved update. However, I was quite surprised to find a decent amount of pushback on this, even from pro players. So today, I just wanted to share my thoughts on this topic and this debate, and why I feel this was a good change. However, perhaps some other changes could be made to make both sides happy without reverting this change to visual recoil. So diving right in, one of the arguments I've seen with this debate in favor of the pre-patch visual recoil is now with this reduced visual recoil, shooting your gun feels less immersive. It doesn't feel like your gun is as powerful because it's not kicking as hard, at least visually. And while I agree, if the goal is realism and making it feel like those guns really have a lot of power, yes, reducing this visual recoil does make that less immersive. However, I don't think this argument is well suited to Call of Duty, and I would take it much more seriously if we were playing a milsim shooter. COD is and always has been a very arcadey experience with very heavily exaggerated super soldier movement speeds and handling, and this is especially true in Black Ops 6 with Omni movement. In this game, we can dive off a 15-meter platform, land on our belly, get up, and now sprint faster than Usain Bolt with a full kit on, and then we can immediately stop sprinting within hundreds of milliseconds and get shots on target accurately. So if we're looking at immersion when it comes to gameplay elements, visual recoil should be the tiniest concern that you have compared to all of the other ridiculous things that you can do gameplay-wise. Now, just a quick aside, my thoughts are a little bit different if we're just talking about the visual immersion, the art style of the game, and the visual presentation of the game. So we're talking like the wacky skins and stuff, and literally shooting aliens and demons on the map. I can definitely understand some of the complaints when it comes to that, but when we're talking about actual gameplay elements, COD has always been quite clearly defined as a very arcadey shooter. And over the past 2 decades of Call of Duty, with the one big exception being Modern Warfare 2, the most recent Modern Warfare 2, visual recoil has been very minimal in this series, and it makes sense with all the other things your crazy super soldier can do. So when it comes to this part of the topic, I think less visual recoil rather than more is better suited to the Call of Duty experience. Now, of course, when it came to that opinion, I don't think the majority of people against this change hold that specific opinion. It is just one point that I wanted to touch on. Now let's get into the next point I've been seeing pushing back against this update, and that is this reduced visual recoil reduces the skill gap compared to before, where we had more visual recoil but the exact same actual recoil on our guns. And I couldn't disagree any more with this point. With actual recoil being equal, and the only variable changing here is the amount of visual recoil you experience, or the amount that your gun is obstructing the target as you're shooting, reducing that visual recoil increases the skill gap rather than reduces the skill gap. Because with less visual recoil, you can better see what you're shooting at, and this allows you to make those really fine adjustments to control the recoil and track your targets better. If you can't really see what's going on there, at least to a degree, you're left guessing. Now, I'm not saying you're entirely guessing and there's no recoil control or tracking required with more visual recoil. I'm just saying that you get even finer control and the ability to make even more precise adjustments as your ability to see what's going on improves. And since visual recoil is introducing a layer of randomness to that, and randomness almost always reduces the skill gap in video games since by nature it can't be controlled, I would say reducing visual recoil very clearly increases the skill gap. On top of this, when it comes to the various inputs in the game, while I do think this change was actually good for everyone, controller and mouse and keyboard, I would say this was a really great change for mouse and keyboard players out there. And generally speaking, with cross-input play, especially in multiplayer with the closer quarters engagements, mouse and keyboard is the weaker of the two inputs, on average at least. And therefore, I think this is a great way to help bring those mouse and keyboard players up a little bit, while simultaneously making the game feel better for controller players as well. Because while visual recoil doesn't harm controller players as much as mouse and keyboard players, since of course we have aim assist to fall back on, and that will help to a degree even if we can't quite see all the details of what we're shooting at, aim assist is there guiding us, helping us out a little. So it's not as impactful to controller players, but it's still not a nice thing to be dealing with as a controller player. You still can't see what you're shooting at as well with high visual recoil. And while aim assist helps, it doesn't do everything when it comes to all those precise adjustments that are required to stay on target, and therefore less visual recoil is still beneficial for controller players. but definitely more beneficial for mouse and keyboard players out there. So I think this is the perfect solution to help equalize those inputs a little bit while making both inputs happy, because it's improving things for both sides of the equation. And this leads me to the final point that honestly, I think a lot of the people that are stating the previous point I just covered, I think at their core, this is what people actually mean and could actually get on board with. This is the take that now after this update with reduced visual recoil, the guns feel too accurate even though actual recoil hasn't changed. And this, I think, is actually a very reasonable take when it comes to this situation. With reduced visual recoil, it is easier to control that recoil. It's easier to see what you're shooting at, and therefore, on average, for many players at least, they're going to be more accurate. They're going to be hitting their shots more effectively, and they're going to be killing faster and easier than they were before this update, despite the fact that the actual recoil hasn't changed at all. And I do think this especially applies to the higher skill groups as well, like the pro players, for instance. I think this is one of the reasons some of the pro players are complaining about this, but perhaps wording things improperly, which is creating a lot of backlash against them. With the higher skill players especially, in my eyes at least, these are the players that are most capable of making those super precise adjustments now that they can see a little bit better. And therefore now, after this update, it feels like guns are just absolute lasers. Even though previously they were lasers, you just weren't able to take advantage of it as heavily as you can now because you couldn't really see what was going on as well as you were firing your gun. So that little bit of randomness with the visual recoil was sort of keeping them in check and unable to hit their shots as effectively. So when making this argument, I can really see where they're coming from with this one. However, I don't think the solution to this is reverting the change and adding visual recoil back and making it harder to see what you're shooting at. I think the proper solution, if there is a real issue here, at least with specific weapons, is to increase the actual recoil that certain weapons have, or perhaps reduce the effectiveness of the recoil improving attachments while maintaining low visual recoil overall. So then we'd still maintain the benefits of being able to see what you're shooting at, making those fine adjustments. And we'd also see that great benefit for mouse and keyboard players especially, while also still benefiting controller players. And with this increase to actual recoil, this would just further increase the skill gap because it takes skill to actually control that recoil, especially when you can see what's going on. And this would be a far better solution than making it harder to see what's happening. And therefore, at least to a small degree, you're left guessing with your shots and kind of hoping for the best. Now, to be clear, I'm not necessarily calling for increased recoil across the board for all of the guns in the game or anything. I just think in some specific situations, if a gun is overperforming in the accuracy department, perhaps now after this update, some individual adjustments to various weapons or their recoil reducing attachments may be in order to keep weapon balance in a good state. But of course, those are just my thoughts, and this is where I'm curious to hear from you guys in those comments down below. How are you feeling about this visual recoil adjustment that we saw with the update a couple days ago? Are you on the side that's celebrating this update and thinks it's a great thing that they reduced that visual recoil? Or are you on the other side, you think this was a bad change and they should revert it and re-increase our visual recoil? Or perhaps are you somewhere in the middle where you think maybe some guns need more actual recoil while maintaining the new lower visual recoil that we have? Just let me know all of those thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.